In 1982, there was a short but decisive war between Britain and Argentina in the South Atlantic over the possession of the Falkland Islands, or Las Islas Malvinas. The conflict began as an undeclared war. On April 2, 1982, the Argentine military junta led by General Leopold Galtieri successfully invaded the Falkland Islands. The invasion triggered a swift response from the UK. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher counterattacked and waged a successful war on land, sea, and air. The war lasted 74 days and ended with Argentina's surrender on June 14, 1982. As of today, the islands continue to be a British overseas territory. The UK maintains administrative control and a permanent military presence there. However, Argentina still claims sovereignty over the islands, which they refer to as Las Islas Malvinas. Diplomatic relations between the UK and Argentina were restored in 1989 following a meeting in Madrid at which both Britain and Argentina issued a joint statement about re-establishing consular relations and agreeing to a framework on sovereignty which would allow further talks. The Falklands War took place in 1982 during the Cold War, but it didn't fit the international dynamics of the Cold War. Both Argentina and the UK were close allies of the United States. The Falklands War was fought between a global power and a regional power that were on the same side during the Cold War. This created diplomatic tension throughout Western Europe and Latin America. The war was a disaster for the Argentine military junta. It ended military rule and played an important role in restoring elective democracy. In the UK, the Falklands War burnished Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's political reputation as the Iron Lady, which resulted in her landslide re-election in 1983. The historiography of the Falklands War is extensive. Sir Lawrence Freedman wrote the sanctioned history of the conflict for the British in the official history of the Falklands campaign. There are 2 volumes. The first focuses on the history of the dispute over the Falkland Islands. The second volume focuses on the 1982 war. Several key commanders of British forces have also written about their experiences in the Falkland War. Martin Middlebrook, a British historian, had access to Argentine military personnel who had planned and fought in the war. And his book, The Argentine Fight for the Falklands, is particularly valuable in understanding Argentina's perspective, especially the junta's plans, the experiences of soldiers, and the consequences of defeat. Recent studies have explored the broader context of the Falklands War, including the legacy of British colonialism in the Americas and the Argentine perception of Las Islas Malvinas as a relic of British imperialism. As more archival documents from the 1980s are declassified, our understanding of the conflict evolves. I've used footage from the Imperial War Museum's documentary, with permission of course, about the Falklands War. In the description box below, I've included links to the website of the Imperial War Museum and their documentary. Now, in this lecture, I'll explain the historical background of the 1982 war, the Argentine military junta's decision to invade the Falkland Islands, and the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's swift response to the Argentine invasion. But first, take a look at the geographical location of the Falkland Islands. The Falkland Islands comprise approximately 800 islands in the South Atlantic Ocean, about 300 miles east of the Argentine coast. East and West Falkland are the two largest islands. Now, the Argentine denominations are Isla Soledad and Isla Gran Malvina. The largest city and capital of the islands is Port Stanley or Puerto Argentino, which is about 7,800 miles from the UK. Now, the Falkland Islands are a geostrategic asset because of their proximity to Antarctica. Their location plays an important role in global trade and military operations because of their location in the South Atlantic. The Falkland Islands also have several important resources such as fish, squid, seaweed, oil, and natural gas. In 1982, approximately 1,800 people were living in the Falklands. Most of them were British citizens, but some Argentine, Chilean, and US citizens also lived there. The official and predominant language is English. Now, as you can see, the Falkland Islands are far from the UK, approximately 7,800 miles away. So what's Britain's connection with them? In the early 16th century, several sailors had sighted these islands in the South Atlantic, but in 1594, an English sailor named Richard Hawkins mapped the northern coastline and named the islands Hawkins Maidenlands after himself and Queen Elizabeth I. Then almost 100 years later, in 1690, a British captain named John Strong, who was sailing to Chile, encountered bad weather and was forced into the vicinity of the West Falklands. He named Falkland Sound after Lord Falkland, the treasurer of the British Navy at that time. In the early 1700s, no one lived on these islands. But after Europeans established colonies in the Americas, Europeans recognized the strategic importance of these islands to shipping. Meanwhile, unaware of this agreement between France and Spain, Britain sent a naval expedition under Captain John McBride to explore and develop settlements in the Falklands. Spain asserted its claims based on the papal bulls of 1493 and 1494, which divided the Western Hemisphere between Spain and Portugal. And according to these decrees, Spain claimed everything 100 leagues west of the Azores. In response, the British asserted their right of discovery and refused to abandon the Falkland Islands. Although no war broke out, there was an exchange of fire in 1770. And by 1774, the British voluntarily withdrew from Port Egmont but left behind a plaque with the following inscription: "Be it known to all nations that the Falkland Islands, with this fort, the storehouses, wharfs, harbors, bays, and creeks thereunto belonging are the sole right and property of His Most Sacred Majesty George III, King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, Defender of the Faith, etc. In witness whereof this plaque is set up, and His Britannic Majesty's colours left flying as a mark of possession." By S.W. Clayton, Commanding Officer at Falkland Islands, 1774. Now let's take a closer look at Argentina's claim to these islands. Starting in 1766, Spain governed Las Islas Malvinas as part of the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata. On July 9, 1816, Argentina declared independence from Spain. and Argentina asserted its claim over the Falkland Islands due to their geographical proximity and because they were rightfully inherited from the Spanish crown. In 1829, British interest renewed with the appointment of Louis Vernet as governor, who enforced fishing regulations and destroyed military installations on the islands. The British responded by dispatching HMS Tyne and HMS Clio, with Captain Onslow raising the British flag on January 3, 1833. This marked the beginning of the dispute between the UK and Argentina over the island. In the 20th century, the Falkland Islands issue gained international attention after World War II, when the UN Committee on Decolonization listed the Falkland Islands for decolonization. They agreed to include Argentina's denomination Las Islas Malvinas in the official description. In December 1965, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 2065, urging the governments of Argentina and the UK to negotiate for a peaceful solution considering the interests of the Falkland Islands population. Now, this resolution set the stage for the next 17 years of largely fruitless negotiations. The sticking point for the British was the issue of self-determination. The British argued that the wishes of the islanders had to be considered first and foremost. The population of the islands was small, and the people who lived on the islands did not seek a change in status. The Argentines took a more literal view of the Resolution 2065 and insisted that the interests of the islanders, rather than their wishes, should dominate the discussion. Some progress was made, including an agreement in 1971 that established regular air service between the islands and Argentina. However, definitive progress on the issue of sovereignty did not develop. The lack of movement in negotiations led to another UN resolution, Resolution 3160, in December 1973. That resolution declared the need to accelerate negotiations and proceed without delay. Many Latin American countries and regional organizations like Mercosur and the Organization of American States expressed support for Argentina's claim. Now, while there was sympathy for Argentina's historical and geographical arguments, the principle of self-determination still holds significant weight in international law and diplomacy, providing strong support for the UK's position. Now let's briefly review the history of Argentina during the 1970s. Some historians view the Argentine military junta's invasion of the Falklands in 1982 as the culmination of a series of miscalculations by the Argentine military. Simply establishing that bad decisions made by the junta led to the defeat of Argentine forces does not add much to the analysis of the conflict. We need to understand the historical context in which those decisions were made. The Cold War redefined the mission of Latin American armed forces. During the 1950s and 1960s, Southern Cone countries developed national security states, prioritizing domestic order above all other goals. Now, why did they do that? During the Cold War, the goal was to get rid of communist movements and Marxist insurgencies within the nation. The School of the Americas, which was located in the Panama Canal Zone until 1983, provided training in counterinsurgency tactics for Latin American military officers. Argentina was the first national security state in Latin America. The Cold War altered the missions of Latin American armed forces by involving them in nation building and governance. The armed forces were trained to view civilian politicians as corrupt, inefficient, and a threat to national welfare. From 1955 to 1974, Argentine armed forces played a significant role in the political realm. That period saw the overthrow of Juan Perón in 1955, followed by periods of military dictatorship and the emergence of several insurgents. The military had overthrown and exiled Perón, but it could not wipe out the loyalty of his followers. Peronistas accounted for approximately 25% of the electorate, and this posed a big challenge for the military. They hated Perón, yet they could not govern without the support of the Peronistas. So to deal with this dilemma, the military allowed Perón to return to Buenos Aires from his 18-year exile in Madrid and let him run for president on the condition that he would end guerrilla activity and restore law and order. Now, this was in 1972. Perón was already 78 years old, and as promised, Perón launched several counter-terrorist operations to suppress insurgencies. Perón also negotiated formal agreements with labor and industry that pledged compliance with a wage and price freeze. Now, these agreements didn't last long because of inflation and a huge rise in international oil prices. Then Perón died in July 1974. His third wife, Isabella, became the president. Now, this was a nightmare situation for the armed forces. Argentina experienced economic stagnation and high inflation. Manufacturing production declined, unemployment increased, and this drastic reduction in household earnings contributed to widespread financial misery, political discontent, and social turmoil. And the armed forces didn't think an inexperienced female commander-in-chief could handle labor strikes, domestic terrorism, and high inflation. After a year and a half in 1976, a coup led by General Jorge Rafael Videla overthrew Isabel Perón to establish a military junta. My point is that the military dictatorship, which began in 1976, was not an isolated experience, but the most extreme version of a series of military interventions in Argentine politics. With each intervention, the level of confrontation between the armed services and civilians escalated. Anyone who criticized or opposed the government constituted a security threat to the state. Now, in the past, military interventions in politics had been brief, and they were designed to suppress popular political opposition so that civilian governments favorable to the elite. But when the armed forces took control in 1976, they sought to rebuild the economy and permanently eliminate all perceived political threats through a combination of orthodox economic liberalization and dirty war called the process of national reorganization, or simply El Proceso. It was a systematic campaign of state terrorism that targeted dissidents, especially armed Peronistas, and Argentines lived in fear and dreaded the nighttime knock on the door fearing unknown kidnappers would take loved ones never to return. The junta attempted to reverse the economic decline by repeatedly devaluing the peso, but that led to greater inflation, unemployment, and a rash of bank failures. In addition, government revenue from taxes was severely diminished. Moreover, half of Argentina's external debt was scheduled for repayment in 1983. Simply put, the state was on the verge of insolvency. In December 1981, General Leopold Galtieri, who commanded the army, became president. General Galtieri became president at a time when recession hit Argentina. Labor union leaders re-established the General Confederation of Labor, the CGT, and launched a series of strikes. The Catholic Church, which had initially adopted a policy of accommodation towards the junta, distanced itself from the government by publicly reaffirming its commitment to democratization and forming an alliance with the labor movement. Mothers of the victims of the Dirty War gathered in increasing numbers in the Plaza de Mayo and demanded an explanation from the government for the disappearance of their children. These demonstrations came to the attention of the foreign press, other governments, and non-governmental organizations. As a result, the military government was under mounting international pressure to improve its human rights record. The military junta failed to revive the economy, and several scholars have suggested that by 1982, the best hope for the armed forces to remain in power and salvage their dignity was to succeed in a conflict. On March 26, 1982, the military junta ordered the invasion of the Falkland Islands. On April 1st, General Galtieri's forces landed on the islands, and on April 2nd, the governor of the Falklands, Rex Hunt, surrendered to the Argentine forces. General Galtieri's forces successfully invaded and captured most of the land. The junta rejoiced because it thought its quick and easy victory in the Falklands would somehow gain public support in a time of economic hardships. The military junta didn't expect their invasion of the Falkland Islands to provoke an international response. Now, on April 3rd, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 502, which contained three critical clauses. One, it demanded the immediate end of hostilities. Two, it required the immediate withdrawal of all Argentine forces from the Falkland Islands, Las Islas Malvinas. And three, it called for the governments of Argentina and Britain to seek a diplomatic solution. Now, this UN resolution was a diplomatic victory for the British, but it did not resolve the dispute. The UK's reaction to Argentina's bold move was swift. Within days, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher dispatched the Royal Marines and the Royal Air Force to the South Atlantic. In the weeks that followed, the armed forces of both Britain and Argentina engaged in battles to gain control of the seas and air around the Falklands. Argentina surrendered on June 14, 1982. Less than 2.5 months after the Argentine invasion, the Falkland Islands had been retaken by British forces. Now let's briefly review British politics and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's decision to send the Royal Navy and Air Force to the Falklands. Margaret Thatcher's decision to deploy the task force was influenced by political and strategic factors. Labour governments had been in power since 1974. Britain was hard hit by the recession of the 1970s, and of all the industrial nations, Britain had the highest rate of inflation. The value of the pound dropped to a new low in global financial markets. Voters blamed the Labour Party for high unemployment rates, frequent strikes, and labour disputes. The Tories, that is the Conservatives, led by Margaret Thatcher, won the elections in 1979. Margaret Thatcher, the first woman Prime Minister in a major Western nation, opposed big government. She immediately cut taxes, privatized the state's share in oil, telecom, and other industries. She cut government funding to education, arts, and social programs. She managed to curtail the power of labor unions and curb inflation, but private sector layoffs led to greater unemployment. Now, before the Falklands War, Margaret Thatcher's approval ratings were very low, and her government faced criticism for its handling of the economy and social issues. In April 1982, the Argentine invasion of the Falklands was met with shock and outrage in the UK. The islands were a British overseas territory, and their capture was seen as a direct challenge to British sovereignty. The UK argued that the Argentine invasion violated international law, and Margaret Thatcher hoped a successful military operation would potentially bolster her political standing. And while preparing for military action, Thatcher's government also engaged in diplomatic efforts to isolate Argentina and secure international support. The UK leveraged its NATO alliances and sought to build a case for its actions in the UN. The British government effectively used the media to garner public support for the operation. Their narrative focused on defending British subjects and reclaiming sovereign territory. Now, the United States played a nuanced role during the Falkland War. The relationship between Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and US President Ronald Reagan was one of the most significant political partnerships of the Cold War. Their combined efforts in promoting free market principles, strengthening Western defenses, and confronting the Soviet Union contributed significantly to the end of the Cold War and the global shift towards neoliberal economic policies. Now, although the US had ties with both the UK and Argentina, the Reagan administration ultimately provided significant support to the UK. Now, the British had a distinct disadvantage in terms of geography. The task force sailed nearly 8,000 miles to reach the theater of war. Argentina also had a dramatic numerical advantage in aircrafts and ground forces. The southern winter and onset of foul weather made it difficult for British operations. And a war which on paper looked like it should have been won by Argentina turned into what appeared to be a rather easy British victory.
On the Argentinian side, there was a sense of failing morale. They were encouraged in Port Stanley to continue the fight, to fight from house to house, from street to street. But they were tired, they were hungry, they were cold, many of them were injured. The morale was sagging. It was in this situation that General Menendez was contacted by Michael Rose of the Special Forces with an invitation to discuss surrender terms.
Brigadier Rose flew into Stanley in a gazelle with a large white sheet strung up underneath and negotiated the Argentinian surrender before Major General Moore met General Menendez to sign it.
I was pretty nervous about this meeting, really. After all, I'd never taken a surrender before, and it wasn't one of the subjects that had come up while I was at Staff College. I told him that we'd greatly admired the way many of the Argentinians had behaved, and presented the document, which he looked at, and said that he didn't like the word unconditional before surrendered. He felt that this was belittling to him and his troops, and therefore, since it didn't seem to me to make a great deal of difference to the facts of the case, was quite happy to cross it out. Then, after a bit of discussion, we had a cup of tea and departed on our various ways.
The surrender was finally signed at 9 p.m. on the 14th of June 1982, and with it, the battle for the Falkland Islands was over. For the British, it was the fighting skills of their soldiers which had ultimately made the difference. Unlike the largely conscript army they had faced, the British forces were elite, professional soldiers. Whether outnumbered at Goose Green or fighting uphill in the pitch black on Tumbledown, they maintained the initiative and kept moving forward. The fighting had been hard and at times bloody, but after 74 days, Stanley was back in British hands. Nearly 1,000 people, Argentinian, British and Falkland Islanders, had lost their lives.
The war left lasting impacts on both nations, reshaping their political landscapes and reaffirming the importance of effective military strategy and international alliances. The successful outcome of the conflict significantly boosted Margaret Thatcher's popularity. It reinforced her image as a strong and decisive leader, contributing to her landslide victory in the 1983 general elections. And the victory in the Falklands played a crucial role in consolidating the Conservative Party's position in British politics throughout the 1980s. The conflict reaffirmed the UK's global military capabilities and its willingness to defend its territories, impacting international perceptions of British resolve and strength. Now, while the sovereignty dispute over the Falkland Islands remains unresolved, the Falkland Islands have developed a robust economy based on fishing, tourism, and more recently, oil exploration. Investments in infrastructure, healthcare, and education have improved the quality of life on the islands, reinforcing the islanders' preference to remain under British governance. The Argentine junta, led by General Galtieri, made numerous strategic, operational, and diplomatic errors that contributed to their defeat in the Falklands War. Now, these mistakes included underestimating British resolve, failing to secure international support, inadequate military preparation and logistics, fragmented leadership, and misjudging the domestic political ramifications. The cumulative effect of these errors led to Argentina's failure to achieve its objectives and ultimately to the downfall of the junta. General Galtieri resigned as leader of the military junta. Please check the description box below for links to the Imperial War Museum's documentary and other resources. Thank you.